In 1947, J.R.R. Tolkien published a short story titled Leaf by Niggle. And in this story, we're introduced to a small, somewhat peculiar man named Niggle who lives by himself in the countryside and is consumed by his life's single passion, painting. The townspeople, along with Niggle's sole neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Parrish, had long questioned the usefulness of his vocation and work, but nevertheless, that didn't deter Niggle. He was fixated on this one particular painting he envisioned. Now, originally it started out in his mind as a single leaf blowing in the wind, but he soon realized that it wasn't just a leaf he had to paint. The leaf was connected to a magnificent tree, thrusting into the ground the most fantastic roots. Strange birds were settled in some of the branches, and through the gaps in between the leaves, you could see a countryside open up in the distance, a glimpse of a forest beyond that, and snow-capped mountains in the furthest horizon. The canvas kept getting larger and larger, so much so that he needed a ladder to reach the top of it. This would be the fullest expression of his labor as an artist, his magnum opus, his life's crowning achievement. He knew he'd have to block out everything else to finish this work because there was a journey he had to take, a final journey to a distant place. And at some point, probably quite soon, a man would come with a horse and carriage, and he'd have to leave with him, never to return. And so Niggle began his work on this great tree. The problem was that he kept getting interrupted. First it was jury duty. Then a distant friend became ill. Then his neighbor, Mr. Parrish, had back pain. Then visitors from the town just kept stopping by. They liked the idea of having tea in the countryside, and when they'd asked to come visit, Niggle couldn't say no. According to Tolkien, Niggle wasn't particularly kind. In fact, he often cursed these interruptions in his heart. His heart wasn't kind, but it was soft. And whenever people needed his help or hospitality, he'd feel uncomfortable denying them, and so he'd eventually oblige. And then there was a knock on his door. It was Parrish, telling Niggle that his wife had become ill. He wondered if Niggle could go to town to fetch the doctor. Furthermore, the recent storm had blown off some of the tiles in his roof, so if Niggle could also put a word in with the town's builder and fetch him as well, Mr. Parrish said. You see, Niggle had a bicycle and Parrish didn't, and even if Parrish did have a bicycle, he had a bad leg. It caused him a lot of pain. And so Niggle was stuck. He had a picture to paint and barely time to finish it. And a part of Niggle wondered whether Parrish's wife had just a common cold. But he found himself saying, okay. And he set off for town, fetching the doctor and the builder. On his way home, riding his bicycle in the wind and rain, he became soaked to the bone and caught a chill himself. And so when the doctor finally arrived the next day, he had two patients to deal with, Mrs. Parrish and Niggle. Niggle lay in bed for days with a high fever. But at the end of a week or so, he finally had the strength to get out of bed and resume his work on the tree. He climbed the ladder and began to paint when there was yet another knock on the door. It was a tall man, a complete stranger, and he identified himself as the driver of the horse and carriage ordered long ago. "It has come at last," the driver said. "You start today on your journey." And beginning to weep, Niggle grabbed a small bag of his essentials and left for the long journey. Sometime later, the townspeople came by Niggle's house and saw the enormous canvas, and they found it quite useful for patching up the roof of Parrish's home. A corner of the canvas, however, had been torn off, and a long time later, a townsperson found it lying in a field. On it, painted, was a mountaintop and a few leaves. It was brittle, though, so most of the corner crumbled apart, except for one beautiful leaf. The townsperson left it with the town museum. They framed it, hung it on a wall in the corner. A few eyes saw it. It was titled "Leaf" by Niggle. But eventually, the museum burned down, and the leaf, along with Niggle, were forgotten altogether. Now, as the story goes, that was the end of Niggle's painting, but it wasn't quite the end of Niggle. The long journey first landed him in some sort of hospital for quite some time, but eventually he was permitted to go to a distant countryside. And as he began to walk around there, he realized the hills and grass felt familiar, like he'd seen them before. And as he was walking along, something suddenly blocked him from the sun, and he turned to see what it was. It was a tree. A magnificent tree with its fantastic roots thrusting into the ground, strange birds perched in its branches, and beyond it you could see a forest in the distance and snow-capped mountains in the furthest horizon. As he examined the leaves of the tree, he realized they were his. He had made, in some sense, those leaves, but upon further inspection, it struck him that the leaves were made somehow in collaboration with Parrish. And no sooner had this hit him when a man came strolling by. It was, in fact, Parrish. They soon realized they worked quite well together, and they began beautifying and building and creating an even more magnificent landscape together. The end. We are in a series titled Everyday Spirituality. And in this series, we're looking at the stuff of everyday life, the practices we engage in almost every single day, and we're asking the question, what does this have to do with God? What does this have to do with my life with God? If I was made for relationship with Him, to walk with Him at every moment of every day, well then what does it mean to walk with Him when I eat, when I work, when I shop, and when I play? What does it mean to live with God in the everyday stuff of life? We've talked about, sleeping, dreaming, getting up, or waking up, getting ready, traveling. Last week, we began talking about work, and this morning, we're talking about work yet again. If you missed last week, I highly encourage you to listen to the sermon online, because this really is the second part or second half of a two-part sermon on work. Last week, we looked at Genesis in some detail and saw that work was created to be good and meaningful, although, of course, it's fraught with pain and sin and so many other complications. I have 2 points this morning, evidenced by the subtitle of this sermon. The first is this: work is an occasion or opportunity for love. Work as an occasion for love. Now, there are countless scriptures that we could look at, but I want to show you just a few. And these scriptures show us that in our work, we have the opportunity to love and care for others. And I'm going to go through these quickly, but the first 2 passages are put in the negative, so they show the impact of bad work upon other people. Proverbs 10:26, like vinegar to the teeth and smoke to the eyes, so are the lazy to their employers. So here in this passage, it's lazy work that negatively impacts at least an employer. A lazy employee is like vinegar to an employer's teeth, smoke to their eyes, a nuisance, a bother. Proverbs 18:9, whoever is slack in his work is a brother to him who destroys. What this is saying is that slack work or lazy work is close kin to destructive work. There's not much difference between being a lazy worker and a worker who destroys rather than builds. So both of these passages are put in the negative. They demonstrate the opposite of love, the opposite of caring for others. They show how bad work or lazy work hurts other people. Leviticus 19:13, you shall not keep for yourself the wages of the laborer until morning. So this one is not for employees but employers, about the just treatment of day laborers. Exodus 23:12, 6 days you shall do your work, on the 7th you shall rest, so that your ox and your donkey may have relief, and your homeborn servant and the resident alien may be refreshed. So this rule about the Sabbath here is also found in 2 other places in the 10 Commandments, so Exodus 20, and then also in Deuteronomy 5. And in all of these passages, they include in the Sabbath command a command for employers to ensure the rest of others. These passages teach that Sabbath rest is not just for you, it's for your employees. Make sure they're able to rest and be refreshed. Don't overwork them. And then notice that they're commanded to give rest to their donkeys and oxen too. So also Proverbs 12:10, whoever is righteous has regard for the life of his animal, but the mercy of the wicked is cruel. Some of you might be disappointed, but this is not about pets. Israelites didn't keep animals as pets. It's about their work animals. But notice how those work animals are to be treated with regard. Leviticus 19:35 and 36, you shall not cheat in measuring length, weight, or quantity. You shall have honest balances, honest weights, an honest ephah, and an honest hin. Now, I know we're going through all of these passages far too quickly, but what we're seeing in these passages is that in our work, of course, we interact with employers, employees, coworkers, business or trade partners, maybe even animals, and our work can either be an occasion for love, an opportunity for us to love and care for those around us, or not, or the opposite. Very few of us work alone. Even if you work from home, you probably don't work alone. And in your work, you can love other people or not. But there's a second point to be made here about how work can be an occasion for love. I'm going to show you a passage in 1 Thessalonians in the New Testament, written by the early Christian leader Paul. But just to give you some context for this passage, in addition to planting churches, Paul worked as a tent maker. We learn that from the book of Acts, and that's the work that he's going to be referencing in this passage. 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 8. So deeply do we care for you that we're determined to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you've become very dear to us. You remember our labor and toil, brothers and sisters. We worked night and day so that we might not burden any of you while we proclaim to you the gospel of God. He says something similar in 2 Thessalonians 3:7. You yourselves know how you ought to imitate us. We were not idle when we were with you, and we did not eat anyone's bread without paying for it. But with toil and labor we worked night and day so that we might not burden any of you. This is not because we do not have that right, but in order to give you an example to imitate. When Paul was in Thessalonica leading the church there, he could have just worked for the church and received his financial support from them. And Paul does receive financial support from many other churches, but not Thessalonica. We learn elsewhere in the New Testament that the Thessalonian church was very, very poor. They were actually quite generous, but they were very, very poor. And so why does Paul work when he's among them making tents in Thessalonica? Not because he wants to, not because he's been envisioning the most magnificent tent all his life and he just needs the time and space to produce it. No. He works night and day making tents out of love for the Thessalonians to lessen their financial burden. So he doesn't need to accept their financial help. And he then encourages them to see their own work the same way, as a way in which they can love one another. 1 Thessalonians 4:9. Now concerning love of the brothers and sisters, you do not need to have anyone write to you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love one another, and indeed you do love. But we urge you, beloved, to do so more and more, to aspire to live quietly, to mind your own affairs, and to earn your own living, as we directed you, so that you may behave properly toward outsiders and dependent on no one. Notice the connection in this passage between love and work. You do love, but love even more so, Paul says. How? By living quietly, minding your own affairs, and earning your own living, working hard. Here's the point. When you think about your work and its purpose, don't just think about the work itself, which we focused on last week, because your work is part of a larger fabric that is your life, a larger fabric that includes family and neighbors and friends and a church community. And part of the reason why work matters is not just the work itself, but the way it allows for you to care for other people, so that you can support yourself, so that you can support others, so that you can lessen the burden of your brothers and sisters. Do you see that? You know, years ago, I was pastoring college students, and every now and again, I would teach them about work and about how they might discern their calling or their vocation in life. And I can't remember exactly where I'd gotten this from, but I used to teach them that when you're discerning your vocation, discerning your future work, you need to ask yourself two main questions. First, what am I most passionate about? Another variation on that question is where am I most gifted? And the second question you ask yourself is, where is the world most hurting? And your work then, I explained, is where those two questions converge, where your passions, your gifts, your abilities, and the world's pain, the world's hurt, the world's need meet. That's how you figure out what you're supposed to do in life. Sounds pretty cool, right? Now, I still like those questions. I think they can be helpful. But it dawned on me a few years ago, and then I became quite embarrassed about it, that those questions regarding work were only possible for the middle and upper classes in contemporary society. Like, they're not bad questions, and if you're privileged to be able to consider those questions, like, by all means do so, but if you're the working poor, barely able to get by, those questions are just cruel. Like, I assure you, not all migrant workers from Central and South America just so happen to all be gifted and so passionate about picking strawberries 12 hours a day in the summer heat. Like, not all workers are passionate about and gifted for cleaning toilets or bussing tables or working on a factory line. Historically, those questions make no sense either. Like, in most other times and places, you don't become a blacksmith because you're so passionate about iron and horseshoes. You become a blacksmith because your dad was one. And that's that. And listen, here's the point. There is nothing wrong or shameful about working as a means of making money, even if you're stuck doing something that you don't love. You know, I think there's this, and I saw it happen, there's this subtle shaming that happens. I used to see this actually in the attitudes many of my former college students had, specifically towards their parents in particular. There was this subtle shaming toward their parents who chose a profession because of its security and money. They missed what life's all about, they would say. They sold out. Nonsense. Nonsense. It's likely their sacrifice afforded you, college student, the luxury of choosing a major in college and a future vocation that you are in fact passionate about. Is it a wonderful gift to be able to do what you love in your work? Of course. I would wish that and pray that for everyone. That your paid work would be at the intersection of those two questions, your passions and the world's deepest needs. But even if you're not able to do what you love in your work can still be an act of love. Not just as you care for your coworkers and all those you interact with in the workplace, but also as you work hard to be able to provide financially for yourself, for those around you, for your neighbors, for your church. That kind of work matters too. Do you remember the strange story about Nigel? What's interesting is that when he inspected the great tree in the far-off country, he noticed, as he stared at the beautiful leaves, that they were his leaves, but they were made in collaboration with Parrish. Now, what does that mean exactly? Now, Tolkien doesn't come out and explain it, but I wonder if we're supposed to rethink what Nigel's work was to begin with. Was it just the painting? Was it just the single, solitary, triumphant expression of his artistic genius captured on that canvas? Or did his real work, his real vocation, his real calling also include all the so-called interruptions as well? Most notably, the interruptions of Parrish. Surely Nigel was called to create. Surely Nigel was supposed to be an artist. That was his work, but he was also a neighbor to Parrish, also a citizen of that town. And what he discovered, I think, in that far-off country, which I think is obviously in this story the afterlife, is that his real work was the painting, plus all the interruptions, plus all the obligations, even the interruptions and obligations that kept him from finishing what he thought was his real work. I'll just let this sit with you. You can either view the people around you, your neighbors, your family, your kids if you have them. You can view them as obstacles and interruptions to your life's great achievement, your life's great work, or you can view them as part of the work itself. Your work is an occasion for loving others. Second, work is an occasion for joy. Work is an occasion for joy. So Ecclesiastes is the book, and you heard part of it read earlier. Ecclesiastes is the book in the Bible that says more about work than anywhere else in the Bible. And it says something very interesting about work in a number of places. Ecclesiastes 2:24, there is nothing better for mortals than to eat and drink and find enjoyment in their work or in their toil. Ecclesiastes 3:13, it is God's gift that all should eat and drink and take pleasure in all their toil. Ecclesiastes 3:22, there's nothing better than that all should enjoy their work, for that is their lot. Ecclesiastes 5:18, this is what I have seen to be good. It is fitting to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun, the few days of the life God gives us. I don't know if we're getting the point regarding work and toil, but apparently we should find enjoyment in it. Take pleasure from it. Work should be enjoyable. So why isn't it? Why isn't work fun? Why isn't work pleasurable? I mean, it can be for some of us some of the time, but those moments for many of us seem so few and far between. Now, we already mentioned some reasons last week how work can be oppressive, how work can be enslaving, and if that's the case, really all you can do is pray and then fight to get out of it, fight for your own liberation. But the writer of Ecclesiastes gives us some other reasons work isn't enjoyable. Obstacles to finding pleasure in our toil. One obstacle, Ecclesiastes says, is that we have this insatiable appetite for the fruits of our labor. We always want more, and yet it's never enough. Ecclesiastes 5:10, the lover of money will not be satisfied with money, nor the lover of wealth with gain. Ecclesiastes 6:7, all human toil is for the mouth, meaning that we work so that we can eat, right? Yet the appetite is not satisfied. What he's saying is that the fruits of our labors are rarely enough, no matter how much fruit there is. We have this insatiable appetite for more and more and more. We want something from our work that we just can't ever really get from it. Lasting satisfaction or real fulfillment. Another obstacle is found in Ecclesiastes 2:18. This is the text you read earlier. I hated all my toil in which I had toiled under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to those who come after me. And who knows whether they will be wise or foolish. Yet they will be master of all for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is vanity. So I turned and gave up my heart to despair concerning all the toil of my labors under the sun, because sometimes one who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave all to be enjoyed by another who did not toil for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. What do mortals get from all the toil and strain with which they toil under the sun? For all their days are full of pain. Their work is a vexation. Even at night their minds do not rest. This also is vanity. What is the obstacle for finding joy in work according to this passage? What causes him to despise or to hate his work? Could you see it in the passage? It is the desire for lasting impact. The desire for lasting significance, which is always frustrated by this single reality of human existence: death. When you die, or even when you retire, people will come after you, and who knows whether they'll be wise or foolish. Yet they will be master over all of which you toiled for. So the first obstacle in Ecclesiastes was the desire for lasting satisfaction and fulfillment and the fruit of our labors. The second obstacle was the desire for lasting impact, lasting significance. Elsewhere in the book of Ecclesiastes, the word used to describe this significance, this lasting impact, this true and steady fulfillment is the word gain. That's the word used again and again in Ecclesiastes. And so he asks in Ecclesiastes 3:9, what gain have the workers from their toil? This is a rhetorical question here in its context, of which the answer is nothing. Nothing. At least nothing that can be guaranteed. Nothing that is certain. Nothing that we know will last forever. The only one whose work we know lasts forever is God's. For just a few verses later, he explains this. Ecclesiastes 3:14, I know that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken away from it. God has done this so that all should stand in awe before him. Here's the point he's trying to make. We all want our work to matter, right? Don't we? We all want our work to be significant, and yet none of that is guaranteed. None of that is guaranteed. Maybe it will. Maybe it won't. Who knows? Maybe there will be lasting impact. Who's to say? This is true even if our life's work are raising children. Who's to say? Old Testament scholar William Brown, who wrote an essay on this, shared about a close friend of his, a gifted pastor, he said, devoted spouse and parent, who died suddenly in a tragic car accident. And just days before his untimely death, this friend had received the results of a survey conducted amongst his congregation. And in this survey, one of the questions asked members to identify the most significant form of ministry that the church had provided over the past year. He was greatly disappointed to find out that barely any reference was made to the worship, nothing to his preaching and pastoral abilities. At the top of the list, named as the most significant ministry at the church, were potluck suppers. And he died a couple days later. I couldn't help but cry and laugh at the same time when I read that story. Honestly, as a pastor, it's a bit of a relief. It is a bit of a relief to realize that it could very well be the case that the most lasting impact of this day for you will not be this sermon, but the donuts and coffee you'll have afterwards. Serious. It is a relief to realize that my desperate desire for lasting impact, for influence, for significance, is a burden that my work was never supposed to bear. The writer of Ecclesiastes is saying that if you can let go of your desire for gain, if you can let go of your desperate longing to make a name for yourself that you think will last forever, if you can let go of your obsession over your legacy, then you can look at your work that God has given you to do and you can receive it as a wonderful and surprising gift. It can bring you great joy. You can take pleasure in it. You can find enjoyment in it. Friends, we don't need to ensure our legacies. We don't need to burden our work with the impossible task of lasting forever. We can let go. We can let go because our identity and our future is not in our hands. It's not in our works. It's in God's hands. It's in God's work. God's work lasts forever. Why has He made it so? So that all should stand in awe before Him. Church, your real significance is found not in the name you leave on this earth through your work. I think we know this, but the reason why that's foolish is it's going to be forgotten. Your kids might remember. Your grandkids maybe, but they won't think about you as often as you hope. Your great-grandkids, probably not at all. And after that, good luck. But here's the good news. Your real significance is found in the name you have written, not here on earth, but in the name you have written in heaven. In other words, your real significance is not because the world knows you. And even if the world did know you, that world is passing away. Your real significance is because in Jesus you are known. God knows you. In Jesus, God remembers you. And he notices how much you've been struggling to paint your magnum opus. He notices how much you've poured in to your life's work. He knows you haven't had the time or support or resources you've needed to complete it. And who knows? Maybe when it's all said and done, you'll be surprised like Nigel was. Maybe you'll be surprised to find sometime after that stranger knocks on your door and takes you on to that final journey into the far-off country, that somehow, some way, your little leaf has lasted after all, not in this earth, but in the one to come. Let's pray. God, we hold up our work to you. Our work that never has enough time to complete, that we never have enough resources or support to really get done. We hold up our work, whatever that is, whether it's the raising of children and building a family, whether it's building up a business, whatever that job or work, paid or unpaid is, we lift it up to you and we trust you. We trust you that our real significance is found in your memory and remembrance of us. May we all simply stand in awe of you. In Christ's name we pray, and all God's people said, amen.